If I asked you to name the three biggest superstars in UFC history, you'd probably get a different combination of people, but a main combination would be Conor McGregor, Ronda Rousey, and Jon Jones. As pure pay per view stars, these are the people that sold the most pay per views in their history. In today's video, we are going to be talking about why it's my belief that the biggest superstar across kind of the mainstream culture in today's society is Nick Diaz, not these three people. First of all, when addressing Conor McGregor, clearly this guy's been doing some weight training recently. If you don't believe me, just look up Conor McGregor weights on Twitter. You'll actually see some weight training from Conor. So have fun with that. But either way, Conor hasn't fought in 4 years, and he seems to be kind of less relevant to me by the day. We'll get to that in a bit. Ronda Rousey was the biggest pay per view star for a little bit. Joe Rogan was saying that she was going to beat Floyd Mayweather in a boxing match. That was never going to happen, and she's completely irrelevant. Even after the WWE move, she was irrelevant too. And Jon Jones is just hated. I don't consider you a superstar if you're this really hated guy. Um, Jon Jones, I don't know. It's a tricky one. I'm a little questionable about that statement, but I think that it's hard to be a villain and a superstar. Like, people have come around on Ilya. Ilya has a lot of supporters. Jon Jones does not have a lot of supporters anymore. So that's kind of my initial take on it. But I will say this: when talking about pay-per-views, right? We talk about McGregor did over 2 million buys with Habib, and look at UFC 300, or whatever these things are. In the history of this sport, and we'll come back to this slide. Actually, we will stick on this slide. I lied. In the history of the sport, there's been about, I believe, 13 or so events which with above a million pay-per-view buys. It might be a little bit less than that. All of them are Conor McGregor cards. Every single one of them, except for UFC 100, which was supposed to be the pinnacle fight card of the UFC at the time, the greatest fight card in history. Had a bunch of title fights on it. GSP was on it. He was not the main event. But I will say this: George St Pierre and Nick Diaz did 950,000 pay-per-view buys at UFC 158. Why is this important? GSP has never had that many pay-per-view buys as a main event before. Afterwards, he didn't have it with 217. Hendricks, he didn't have it. Condit, he didn't have it. These were all higher level fights that people thought were legitimate challenges to his belt. I think a lot of people felt that Nick Diaz was not a serious threat for the belt at the time. He had good boxing, good jiu-jitsu, and good pace, but skill for skill, GSP was better than him. So why did this do 950,000 pay-per-view buys? And more importantly, it did more pay-per-view buys than Cormier vs. Jones 2. It did more than Silva vs. Sonnen 2. And it did more than UFC 189, which was one of the greatest cards of all time, and on paper was supposed to be a great card anyways. So how does Nick Diaz versus George St. Pierre do more than these three events? It can't possibly just be George St. Pierre. It's impossible. There's no way he could sell. There's no way GSP on his own versus a random guy could sell more than Cormier and Jones rematch, Silva and Sonnen rematch, which was huge, and a McGregor title fight. Why is this possible? And I'm going to tell you guys why in a second here. But look at the record of Nick Diaz in the last 5 fights. He fought Robbie Lawler in 2021. He lost to Anderson Silva 6 years prior to that. He lost to GSP, like we mentioned. He lost to Carlos Condit. And then BJ Penn in 2011. We're talking about 5 fights in 14 years almost. And Nick Diaz, I truly believe, is the biggest star today in the sport. You know what I mean? And you're going to say to me, okay, well, Ilia Topuria has a lot of edits on TikTok. He's a big star. Everyone knows the El Matador. Everyone knows Alex Pereira. Everyone knows, and by the way, I think Alex Pereira's kind of had a fall off as a star, but it is what it is. Everyone knows Tom Aspinall. As I'm saying this, by the way, I'm realizing we do not have a lot of stars in the sport. But either way, I would be willing to wager that anyone who knows those three knows Nick Diaz. And he hasn't had a meaningful fight in 12 years. And every single person knows Nick Diaz. They all like the edits on TikTok. But why specifically do people love Nick Diaz? UFC 266, which was September of 2021, it's the card where Volkanovski and Ortega had that war. Nick Diaz is called out of a 6-year layoff after being suspended for weed post-fight versus Anderson Silva. On the picture on the right was what he looked like versus George St Pierre. The kid's ripped, he's in great shape, muscled up, jawline looks good, whatever. And GSP and him are both standing after 5. On the left is what Nick Diaz showed up in the cage looking like versus Robbie Lawler after his 6-year return. Fat, kind of has boobs a little bit, like some titty action. Zero muscle structure. There's no vein. You can see the vein slightly on him. The hair's kind of fucked up looking. He's got the beard now. Face is fatter. He looks weathered. He shows up to UFC 266 looking like that. Keep in mind, Jake Shields said that Nick Diaz did not train for the Robbie Lawler fight at 266 after a 6-year layoff. It was further revealed that he had a big debt to the Nevada State Athletic Commission still ahead of that fight. So the UFC, to lure him back, said, we will pay off that debt if you fight Khamzat Chimaev. That was what they offered Nick Diaz initially. And then they're like, okay, if we can get you as a 5-rounder versus Robbie, we'll still pay off this debt. He also had ruptured discs, too. So Nick Diaz had a lot going on. Nick Diaz also started the fight with a jumping, spinning back kick. That shows how little he really cared about the fight. He just wanted to get out of there. He thought it would be funny, whatever. He loses, and then he goes on. He pays his money off. I'm sure the UFC told him, we don't really care what happens. You just need to make it to the fight. That being the case, remember, Nick Diaz, for the UFC 266 fight, had not trained in 5 years. He hadn't fought in 6. And he had a $75,000 debt along with basically a broken back coming into that fight. And Nick Diaz still went on to land 150 significant strikes by the end of round 2. He landed virtually nothing in round 3. That's why I'm not counting it. How is that possible? That a guy who could take 6 years off of the sport, come back and land 150 significant strikes in 10 minutes, basically. 114 to that. He ate 131. He could have kept going, but he had given it all he had at that point. And he was like, man, why am I doing this? I'm just going to give up now. But for a guy to have not trained, to have gone through addiction, and he's still dealing with addiction now, to deal with the stuff that he had dealt with in the time off, the long suspension, having his prime years ripped from him, or the end of his prime, to come out and be like, you know what, I don't owe anything to these fans, but I'm going to give them a war. And by the way, it was a war. Go back and watch this fight. Awesome fight that people hated on at the time. Just a battle in the pocket of 2 boxers. For him to do that, that is why Nick Diaz is the biggest star in the UFC still, and it's why people care about Nick Diaz now. I see more edits of Nick Diaz on my TikTok than I do Zabit, than I do Ilya, than I do Conor McGregor. All I get is Nick Diaz edits. Because of shit like this, dude. That's what makes you a star. You tell me if McGregor came back after a 6-year layoff versus Michael Chandler, for example, and this is kind of a similar style matchup to what it would have been like. You really think that if he started with a spinning kick like that he would throw 150 significant strikes? That he'd just throw caution to the wind and go after it? No, man. And that's why people love Nick Diaz. No leg kicks. He's not woke. He's not doing his woke leg kicks. He's just scrapping like a real man, you know? And in that fight, it was 1-1. I thought it was 1-1. I thought Nick Diaz won the first round and then Robbie got the second. He came back and won a round after not training for 5 years. He didn't owe anything to anybody. He could have gone out there and literally just tapped out on the ground. There was no reason for him to fight. He had a big debt, ruptured discs in his back. He hadn't trained in forever, hadn't fought in forever, was angry at the commission. The UFC tried to give him Khamzat to get him killed. And yet he goes out and wins the first round versus Robbie Lawler, who, by the way, was still an active welterweight, regardless of it being a middleweight at the time. Robbie was fighting once a year at that point. So he was still active-ish. It's a real guy, a real killer that he went in there with. And I really think that's why Nick Diaz is the biggest star, because look at the trends on Google compared to these 3 people. When Nick Diaz fought in September of 2021, Look at the interest on Google for it. This is YouTube search. The Google search is even more than that. Compare that to the little yellow jump that happens. You can see it left of the April 3rd thing. Sorry, I'm yawning. But left of the April 3rd thing was Ronda Rousey's Royal Rumble return. Ronda was the biggest star in her heyday, in Nick's heyday too, to be honest with you. And yet when a big star like that, goes to the Royal Rumble, there's nothing for her. Relatively close to Nick Diaz. GSP hasn't done anything, and yet Nick Diaz always kind of surfaces above the rest of them. Isn't that bizarre? That an active athlete in Ronda Rousey, who was in the WWE until I believe last year, she was battling with Nick Diaz, who hadn't done anything of significance in the past 12 years, basically. That is a star. That is a guy who has way longer longevity than anyone else. Man, no one gave a fuck about Kamaru Usman for a year, and he was the welterweight champ. A lot of people thought that he could have been the welterweight GOAT. No one looks up Anderson Silva shit. I don't get Anderson Silva edits. I don't get tweets about Anderson Silva's legacy. He beat Nick Diaz. I don't get shit about BJ Penn other than the CTE stuff. That doesn't make BJ Penn a star. People care about Nick Diaz. When he got announced versus Vicente Luque, and we'll get to the Colt TikTok following in a second, but when he got announced versus Vicente Luque, it was a thing where no one thought that Nick Diaz was going to win, and yet he gets 16% on Tapology that thought he was going to win. And there was a larger number than that, by the way. A lot of Twitter was like, you know what, man, Nick Diaz might be able to win this fight. This is a guy who was genuinely smoking crack when this was announced. He's in rehab currently for meth and crack addiction. And he was smoking crack, and there are people that thought that he could beat Vicente Luque. That is how loved Nick Diaz is. 41 years old, Vicente Luque was coming off, or no, he hadn't won his fight versus Temba Garimbo, but he was coming off a loss versus, I believe, Joaquin Buckley. That is the level we're at. Some people actually thought that he could beat Vicente Luque at 41 years old, after not fighting in 4 years, basically, since that would have been. That is how much people like Nick Diaz. And let me give you a comparison, for the sake of this. Shavkat Rakhmonov got the same percentage of predictions. That means the same amount of people that felt that Nick Diaz could beat Vicente Luque felt that Ian Gary could beat Shavkat Rakhmonov. And that fight was razor-thin 48-47 to Shavkat. That is how much faith people have in Nick Diaz. So, just incredible stuff. And about the Colt TikTok following, 1.4 million likes on a TikTok edit of Nick Diaz that just has Burt Kreischer being like, oh my god, that's so funny, I can't believe it. You know, or however he laughs, that stupid fucking laugh. That has more likes than any other UFC edit TikTok I've ever seen. Conor McGregor, when you look him up, has 1.3 million on an edit and nothing. Nick Diaz has multiple with 1 million likes. That is how much people like Nick Diaz. They just love the story. He has a story that people can get behind and they appreciate. And they wish he would still fight. That's how awesome Nick Diaz is. That's how loved Nick Diaz is by the UFC fans and by mainstream fans who just know the Diaz brothers. That's how the Nate vs. Conor fight got sold the first time, it was Nick's little brother. So, I really think that when you look at Nick Diaz, this guy is a star, man. I really believe, honestly, in my heart, that he's the biggest star in UFC history currently. Because no one has maintained the longevity that Nick Diaz has in conversation. There's a myth almost around Nick Diaz about how incredible he was. And I don't think that anyone else carries that. Conor, in his prime, maybe? But look at Conor's relevance now. Anytime something new is posted about Conor, people don't give a shit. If Conor got announced to fight today, no one would be like, oh shit, this is badass. If Nick Diaz at 41 years old got announced today, like he did earlier in the year, brother, everyone's going nuts for that. They're all like, holy shit, Nick Diaz is coming back, even if they all think he's going to lose. That's the level of star that Nick Diaz has, and it's why I really believe that he's the biggest star in the UFC right now. That being said, that is going to do it for today's Money Manzel MMA video. I really enjoyed putting this one together, especially because, with prediction videos, you're going to have to eat your words every time. It's really hard to be 100%. and there was just not enough autism and aura on the card to be 100% on it. So yeah, I wanted to switch it up for today's video. I didn't want to do matchmaking. I just didn't care about matchups for a lot of the guys on that Nashville card. It seemed kind of pointless. I'm gonna gear it towards 318 content instead, and probably just talk about how shitty the fight card is. But is what it is. Thank you so much, boys, for listening. I appreciate every single one of you. If you're coming from YouTube Shorts, subscribe, like, and comment. If you're coming from the search feed, subscribe, like, and comment. And if you're coming from my TikTok, which is at Money Manzel MMA, I appreciate you too. Like, comment, subscribe. I'll see you boys in the next one. Peace out.